Okay, rolling. And apologies for my baseball hat. I felt it was less offensive than my hair. Um, and thanks to everybody for putting this together. This is fun to talk about as a group, and I'm excited for our conversation. So what I did here, this module, is about the opium trade in the years leading up to the Opium War of 1839, 1842, and it's a multi-archival analysis of the buying and selling of opium along the littoral of southern Fujian province, just up the coast from Guangzhou or Canton, the only legal port in the years before 1843 for British commerce in China, and the epicenter of the illegal opium smuggling trade. Now, opium in the 1830s, for some context, was experiencing a global boom. The drug had taken root in Southeast Asia and East Asian markets over the course of the 18th century, passed through the diaspora back up to China on boats, up rivers, over mountains, into villages and cities across the Qing Empire, together with the even more popular tobacco smoking habit. Then in the 1820s, fierce new competition on the production end of the opium business inspired the British East India Company to redouble their opium cultivation efforts in Bengal. Each year, British and Parsi, American, and Chinese shippers carried more and more chests of opium to China, each chest carrying around 60 balls of the raw drug ready to be boiled down into thousands of doses. So this module addresses this period between 1832 and 1839, when the British opium importers in the Pearl River Delta started partnering with maritime traders in Fujian to relocate a substantive portion of the import market north to the Fujian coast. And my research demonstrates that roughly around 60% or so of the opium that came to China from India during these years, during the mid and late 1830s, was sold to Chinese buyers from the receiving ships in Fujian. Receiving ships being these stationary British ships that kind of operated as opium and silver warehouses. In investigating the history of the people responsible for this trade, the animating questions, the questions I ask of these sources, the animating kind of reason behind a lot of these maps, which I'll get into later, is how? How do people make money by buying and selling opium? And the answer to that question, and I have more interesting slides later, this is sort of a preamble, apologies. The answer to that question, as I currently stand, is a sort of a split between what we might consider, for lack of a better word, normal capitalism, and then a different sort of considerations that we might consider criminality. Right? To the first point, opium is and should be, but hasn't been, comparable to other stuff, right? Comparable to cotton or tea or sugar, right? These globally circulated agricultural items that have histories of capitalism, right? We don't have that for opium. Sort of interesting, because it seems like it's so hard to compare to other stuff, right? But it was there with other stuff, right? It was in the same boats, it was in the same banks, the same people trading. So why shouldn't we, right, embed opium within its immediate economic context? And so part of my answer to kind of how people made money off drugs looks like the history of other stuff, right? Opium traders prized fast-moving information, seeking to understand and take advantage of price discrepancies. I can say kind of outside of the temporal scope of this module, my research goes into the 20th century, and the long-term kind of trajectory is also comparable to a lot of industries in the sense of horizontal and vertical integration, kind of industry consolidation, and some stuff like that as well. Right, so in some senses, right, how people make money off opium is how they make money off other stuff, right, by buying and selling them in the particular logic of 1830s, capitalism or whatever. And then the other set of considerations on criminality is somewhat different, right? Opium traders were breaking laws. They were bribing officials. They were usually getting away with it. And understanding those particular dynamics is I have found very difficult because of the source base, right? Especially when people who get away with it don't make the archives. And I dive into this problem as a way to introduce the structure of the module, itself conceived as a model for introducing students to multi-archival research. The heart of the module are the second and third paths, where I use a Chinese and a British archive to build up complementary pictures of the opium trade along the Fujian littoral in the 1830s. And each path, I should also say, is a way for me to kind of experiment with creating what I think are very different kinds of experiences within Scalar, in terms of introducing primary sources, using and thinking about maps and storytelling. The first of the two central paths is called The Case Against Shiho, a Qing document. And this is a translation and reconstruction of a document from the #1 historical archives in Beijing, describing the arrest and prosecution of a man named Shiho and 110 others for buying and selling opium. Shiho was a member of the Shi lineage of Yako village in Jinjiang County between the forts of Xiamen and Quezhou. And in the story told in this case, Shiho and a few lineage members grew up a business bringing opium to Fujian from the Pearl River Delta. And then in 1836, they decided to, according to the language of this case, entice a pair of foreign opium merchants named Big and Little Li to bring foreign ships of opium north to Fujian and thereby import the drug directly to the kind of the armada of local maritime traders ready to buy it. And then I later, just as a side note, discovered Big and Little Li from this case to be John Reese of Jardine Matheson Company and his brother Thomas Reese of Denton Company, who were stationed in this bay for many years selling opium. So the way that I've constructed the narrative in this path is a much kind of what I think of now as a traditional linear chronological narrative, kind of walking the reader through chunks of the translation of this case, grouped on pages strategically to map out kind of particular angles on the history and operations of the Shi lineage's opium business. And the path concludes with a reconsideration of the regional geography of statecraft, placing Yako village and Shenhu Bay within the jurisdictional map of the Qing administration. The second, or rather the third path, but the second of the two kind of central paths, the Jardine Matheson Global Network, looks and reads quite differently from the first. Rather than a sort of a micro-historical, chronological narrative like the Shiho path, this path draws on a wider range of evidence from the Jardine Matheson Company archives in Cambridge. And it reconstructs a set of locations and people and practices that together made up the Jardine Matheson opium smuggling operations. Now, as I've indicated on this slide, or at least I've tried to, visitors can navigate this path in a variety of ways, which are really kind of nonlinear, right? By using the map, by using a sort of thematic table of contents pictured here. And there's also an option to kind of scroll through different images from the path and through those navigate to the pages. The logic of inclusion here, right, what I've included, goes back to that central question that I posed at the beginning. How did people make their money off of opium in southern Fujian? It's probably relevant to recognize that my outlook on the Jardine Matheson operation is distinctly Fujian-centric, in the sense that insofar as this company appears in my own research and writing and articles and books, they're a vehicle to kind of better understand. They're not the object of study, right? I use Jardine Matheson to try and understand their Chinese partners and try and figure out who those people were and what they did. So all of this is to say that another person researching Jardine Matheson would come up with a different looking map, right? And especially if they were more interested in other places, right? If they were researching Singapore or India or London. So this map is very particular, right? It kind of thinking about maybe putting the cart before the horse a little bit here, but my response to that prompt about how this module challenges hegemonic cartographic rationality in part relates to this issue, right, of how I set about constructing this particular version of the Jardine Matheson Company's operations. This map, as I understand it, reflects my priorities as a researcher as much as it reflects anything else. And before I go into more depth about the issues of cartographic hegemony and the tangible impact of collaboration on the project, I want to just offer one example of the kind of archival triangulation that I hoped to model for students and other visitors to this module by organizing it in this way, which I've summarized here on this slide. It's basically a story of a sustained practice of $10 surcharges on every chest of opium sold by the British opium importers in Fujian's Shenhu Bay. And this practice was widely enough spread that it made its way into the Qing document about the case, and it's all over the Jardine Matheson archive. The Jardine Matheson records have sort of proved, I think, in a lot of ways that this was money that was going to the state in some way. And my thinking about this has evolved. You know, I'm questioning the utility of the term corruption here, because I do think there's a longer history within kind of historiography on Chinese maritime trade of these sort of informal surcharges on items and things like that. And I think this practice has roots in kind of local traditions of market regulation and stuff like that that I maybe could do a better job elucidating. But my point in bringing it up here is that it's a clear point where the archives disagree about something, right? And I think that's useful for students and readers. So on the issue of hegemonic cartographic rationality, I have to say, while I didn't enter this project with any radical ideas about this, right? My approach to maps, my thinking about space have evolved genuinely over 2 years of working on this. I'm not a historical writer who is particularly inclined to theory. I instead write the way that I understand my contribution to the larger body and structure's aims in this regard is by making a self-conscious effort to use Google Maps in a particular way, to use Google Maps to elucidate a particular logic, right? And if my approach to evidence from Qing and British archives is to process information according to the question of how people make money off opium, then my use of maps within this module should be understood within the same light. In the case against Shiho, maps serve to explain the development of a maritime lineage's opium operations, from the incubation to an almost kingpin regional status, drawing out the ways in which the migration of the opium trade from Guangdong to Fujian in the 1830s was built on pre-existing networks. In the coda to that path, the spatiality of Qing power is explored, kind of signaling Yako village's position within the nested jurisdictional geographies of the Qing territorial government. And then in the path on the Jardine Matheson global network, maps serve to explain that organization's logics of profit, from production, shipping, insurance, political lobbying, right down to the receiving ships on the Fujian coast. And my approach here has been fundamentally structured and influenced by the collaborative environment in which Kate and David had us put these together. It was through articulating the specific logics of how to map changes over time from the perspective of an imperial airline, a disease, a technology, or a religious institution. And what I came to understand as I put these together is the sort of temporal fungibility of these mapped out logics. Before some enterprising farmers in Malwa set up an operation to compete with the East India Company opium from Bengal, Bombay was a port city that was irrelevant to the global circulations of opium, a place outside of the considerations of a Scottish opium merchant in Canton or a Fujianese maritime trader. The construction of the Red Rover and other clipper ships permanently altered the significance of what appears to be the exact same sailing route on a Google map from Calcutta to Canton, by eliminating the seasonal patterns of shipping and cutting transportation times to an unprecedented low. The creation of steamship routes in later years would once again alter the spatial logic of opium profits, and any effort to kind of conceptualize the trade in that later period would also require the creation of new maps based on new logics. And I want to add, in addition to challenging my understanding and approach to using maps, this project has seriously challenged my craft as a writer and a storyteller. I said before that I'm not theoretically inclined as a history writer, and that's maybe an understatement. I like good stories more than anything else, and I do think that a well-told story can have its own kind of theoretical impact on a reader. The Jardine Matheson Global Network path in this project completely upended my sensibilities about how to write, how to convey an argument, how to tell a story. Just a brief example, without the pressure to tell kind of one particular narrative within the Jardine sources, I felt a new kind of freedom to include stuff that I felt interesting but couldn't justify placing in the narratives that were essential to the article and the book chapter that I was writing. And here, kind of more than anywhere else, is really where I felt the tangible value of collaboration. And a clear example of that is the page I wrote on experts, which I only conceived of as a result of one of our group conversations, which I think is a really valuable page in the module. So I don't have a ton to add here. I hope I haven't gone long. I just wanted to sort of throw it out there that this project is also challenging other kinds of rationalities that are fundamental to how many of us read and write. Thank you.